at the Rajan Kilachan Mughal tent. The title of this session is Blood and Silk, Power and Conflict in Modern Southeast Asia. You can see it up there. Oh, we've got the wrong slide, but that is the name of our session. I'm sure they'll update it in a minute. I'll say it again for you. It's Blood and Silk, Power and Conflict in Modern Southeast Asia. So we have with us Michael Vatikiotis, who's a writer and a journalist and a diplomat, and he's been working in Southeast Asia since 1987. He was formerly the editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review, and he's written 2 novels set in Indonesia. And we have Victor Mallet, who is a journalist, commentator, and an author with 3 decades of experience in Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And he's currently Asia news editor for the Financial Times. His new book is Ganges, River of Life, River of Death, the Ganges and India's Future. I'll hand over to them for this conversation. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you very much indeed. Everyone can hear at the back. It's great to have you here, Michael. Michael is not just an academic expert or a journalistic expert. He also speaks, I know from personal experience, several Southeast Asian languages extremely well. So it's great to have him here to talk about the region, and it's great to have you here in the audience. Now, Southeast Asia has always been a rather hard place to write about because it contains such a variety of cultures, of languages, of political systems, and in a way, like Asia itself, Southeast Asia isn't really a thing, or it's not a coherent thing anyway. And that kind of weakness of coherence is something that we see even in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which brings together the 10 countries. You know, they have been unable to stop China doing what it wants in the South China Sea. They've been unable to stop the pollution haze that comes every year from Sumatra across Singapore. And the ASEAN leaders, I think, were here in India, or have been here in India in the last few days. It's also a region that is squeezed, as you know, between the ancient great powers and the now rising great powers of India and China. And Michael's book, Blood and Silk, it looks at obviously both the positives and the negatives. He does appreciate the great traditions of Southeast Asia and the good things about it. Its enormous economic success since World War II, its social and cultural inclusiveness and variety, its good humor, and so on. But he also concludes that some of these admirable qualities and qualities that make it such a great place to live and to work and to do business with are being, I think, a little bit overwhelmed by the return of traditional forms of tyranny and authoritarianism from the past, and by new and rather baneful influences from abroad that we see today, not least radical Islam. So I'm going to ask Michael, first of all, to tell us a little bit about the book and why he wrote it, for a few minutes, and then I'll ask him a few questions, and then if we have time, he'll read a short passage about his personal experiences of the region, and then we'll open it up to you, and we should have plenty of time for your questions. So, Michael, just tell us, why did you decide to write this book, and why did you decide to write it now?
Well, I've lived in Southeast Asia for close to 40 years. I first came as a student. I did my postgraduate studies in northern Thailand, having studied Thai and Indonesian at university. And Southeast Asia has been my home for the last 4 decades. And for me, it's a land of perplexing contrasts. It's home, of course, to more than 630 million people. That's half the population of India. And most of these countries are growing at between 5% and 6% a year currently, and have at times grown at more than 10%. That's and of those, because of that extremely rapid economic growth, it's an extremely well-connected society. More than half the population of Southeast Asia is on the internet. Indonesia, which is a population of 260 million people, half of them are on Facebook. But despite that sort of incredible economic prosperity, growth, and connectedness, there is an alarming disparity of wealth, income inequalities, and access to services. And this is the most striking and perplexing contrast for me. In many ways, it's what drove me to write the book. This contrast of stability and prosperity, and yet this great and growing gulf in income and equality. Equality of all kinds, political, social, and economic. 1% of Thais in Thailand, for instance, own 58% of the country's wealth. 1% of the Indonesian population also owns a little over 50% of the wealth. There are 25 families in the Philippines that own more wealth than 75 million fellow Filipinos. In a country like Myanmar, the poverty rate in some rural areas is well over 30%. This profound inequality helps explain to me another disturbing contrast. For all the apparent stability you see on visits to the sort of glitzy capitals of Bangkok, Singapore, KL, Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, Jakarta, Southeast Asia is beset by protracted conflicts, many of them violent, across sizable areas of Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines. You have insurgencies that have been waging war against their governments for almost as long as these countries have been independent, 70 years or so, fighting for freedom and autonomy, very much on the margins, but these conflicts have been ever present. And increasingly, these conflicts are also appearing in mainstream society between Muslims and Buddhists, very alarmingly, Shiites and Sunnis in Indonesia. And one of the key messages of my book has been a warning of the dangerous religious divide that's appearing in a region that is more or less evenly divided between Muslims and Buddhists. Such polarization, I argue in the book, and the neglect of marginal people fighting these sort of conflicts has opened spaces up for Islamic extremists in the last 15 or 20 years. Just last year, a band of well-armed Islamic insurgents took over a small city in the southern Philippines. That's 200,000 people had to flee the city. The city is called Marawi.
And they kept it for several months.
And they kept it for 5 months. The army didn't retake this city for 5 months. And if you go to the internet and look at just Google Marawi siege, and you look at the pictures of devastation in that city, it looks like something out of Syria.
And imagine if this should happen somewhere like India or China or somewhere in the West.
Yeah, there would have been much bigger news.
We would have had much more news about it, absolutely.
And, you know, of course, everyone here will be aware of the forced exodus of more than 700,000 now and counting Rohingya from western Myanmar and Rakhine State in western Myanmar. And today, Islamic radicals are hard at work in the refugee camps of Bangladesh, trying to radicalize these people and sow hatred so that they can come back and wage violence in Myanmar. So many of these grievances, I think, could have been addressed if governments were more responsive to the concerns of people, whether it's wages, whether it's demands for greater autonomy and the space for freedom of worship. But this is a further perplexing contrast for me, is that despite more than 30 years of steady political reform and opening and transparency, often driven by financial crisis, democracy is in retreat in Southeast Asia. Myanmar's democratic transition is going in reverse. Thailand has endured military rule for more than 4 years. Cambodia is threatening to cancel this year's elections. And in the Philippines, President Rodrigo Duterte may be orchestrating a way of staying in power beyond his mandated 6-year term. So in my book, I've tried to explain why all this is happening, both from my experience as a journalist over the last 20 years or so, and over the last 15 years, my role as a private diplomat and mediator in armed conflict. In the process of these 2 careers, I've, of course, networked and supped with sort of political leaders in all these countries, and also met with the rebels and the people who are trying to topple their governments. In between are the enterprising, hard-working people of Southeast Asia who are mostly enduring unimaginable forms of impunity or corruption or lack of access to services like basic education, despite what the statistics say. It's shocking that in Indonesia, which is a country that has had a very successful political transition for almost 20 years, local clinics on the outskirts of Jakarta don't stock basic drugs. And one of the reasons for that, it's just one of the central themes of my book, is the selfishness of people in power who could be supplying and providing basic foodstuffs or lower priced food in many of these countries, but would rather rake off the profits from import tariffs or distribution mafia that forces them to be higher priced and therefore inaccessible. And the World Bank has done some very good work on that. So it's that for me, most perplexing contrast of all, which is why is Southeast Asia a land of such grace and beauty, as well as a place where you have this tremendous prosperity and economic growth? Why is it a place where each year is marked by violence and suffering?
Thank you. I mean, that's a very concise policy analysis, but I think in a way you're selling your book short, because it's full of these wonderful anecdotes of the encounters that you have across Southeast Asia. You've told us a little bit about the problem of the clinics. Tell us a little bit how, there are lots of anecdotes about the super rich and the super powerful and the strange ways in which they behave, whether they're in Java or whether they're in, the Thai royalty. Give us an example of how this kind of, these extremes of inequality, for example, which are causing these kind of problems manifest themselves, and how you come across them in your many travels.
Well, when I was a journalist, it was striking for me that when I first arrived in Southeast Asia, it seemed it was very hard to reach the leadership or the political leaders in these countries. But I made a great effort to do so, inveigled my way into many of the sort of the salons of, say, Jakarta or Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia and in Thailand. And in fact, while at the beginning of my stay in Southeast Asia, you still had this kind of more or less sort of clubbable, Western-educated, colonial hangover of a leadership in places like Malaysia, where people kind of grasped the notions of institutions and legal constraints and so on. What I saw in the 1990s was that generation of leaders essentially died out. And replacing them were leaders who wanted their nations to be very modern, but were basically rather traditional in their approach to leadership. And they drew on traditions of kingship and princely sort of rule that when you got to know them, they were still speaking in English largely and understood and educated overseas, but their basic approach to leadership was very... And one of my favorites in this regard was Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia. Mahathir Mohamad, who to many people in this audience will be the man who basically dragged Malaysia over 20 years into a sort of a period of economic prosperity. But he was a thoroughly traditional man in many ways, and he admired Japan and the way that Japan had grown in the post-Meiji period, and he wanted Malaysia to emulate Japan. And at the same time, he bore several grudges against the West in particular. And he made no bones about this. When you'd meet him in person, he would sort of scowl at you. And he had this wonderful way of saying British. And, I found out later on that his father had actually been a supporter of Chandra Bose and Subhash Chandra Bose, and that there was this whole generation of Malaysians, actually, especially those of Indian descent, who actually were, when the British arrived in Malaya, they began to side with the Japanese, essentially. And across Southeast Asia, there was this nationalist impulse that actually the Japanese were coming to liberate us. They were disappointed, but it did breed in these leaders a sort of, the generation that emerged from the war, a sense of ambivalence towards the West and ambivalence towards, therefore, modern forms of government.
But they also became in some cases, very authoritarian. The Cambodian leader, I forget his many titles, but he's got, I think in your book you detail, he's now known as, can you remember the full title? It's something pretty dramatic, isn't it? It's like Supreme Leader.
He's taken a royal title, essentially.
Right. But it's very long and fulsome, and it's more or less the Supreme Leader of the known world. And
yet he was a man who in 1985 he became Prime Minister. He was literally a former Khmer Rouge soldier who defected to Vietnam. He'd been brought up in this kind of sort of Marxist world, and yet today, we see him essentially dishing out royal titles. We see him behaving very much like a king who can't bear the idea that the country might vote against him. And in fact, he's declared that if people do vote against him, it's an act of war.
Yeah. It's an act of treachery, a bit like Brexit or judges, yeah. Now, if we're talking, you've talked obviously about the deterioration of democracy. You mentioned Myanmar, you mentioned Thailand, you mentioned Cambodia. We could mention other countries in the region as well. Vietnam certainly hasn't gone anywhere with political reform, whatever it's done with the economy. But isn't this simply part of a global phenomenon that we're seeing everywhere? We're seeing it in Turkey, we're seeing it in Russia, we're seeing it in the United States, we're seeing it we're seeing in continental Europe as well, and in Britain to some extent. There's a sort of anti-democratic populist move. You've got more authoritarian governments around the place. Is Southeast Asia really any different from these other parts of the world?
Well, you're quite right,
similar
Victor.
problems?
As I was writing the book, towards the end, Donald Trump was elected president, and Brexit happened, and things started to happen in Europe that were most disturbing in terms of the far right. But my view has always been that Southeast Asia had all the advantages of rapid economic growth, of institutionalization, well-run economies, good economic husbandry for the most part, very little debt, and a sense of community in the different countries and nationhood. That these advantages were squandered. There was a brief period in the 1980s and 90s, where there were moves towards democratization, and the Philippines was a leader. I remember as a journalist at the BBC, huddled in a studio, sort of listening to this great people's power movement in the Philippines before I reached the region, and even that now we see they're closing. Duterte is closing down the media. The Marcoses are going to come back. It's likely that one possible likelihood for the next president of the Philippines, if Duterte steps down, is Bongbong Marcos, the son of Ferdinand Marcos, who in the mid-1980s was routed in a people's power revolution. And I feel that if you want to ask yourself why this is happening, I feel that people make trade-offs. And one of the trade-offs they make is that when our own security is threatened, democracy will become, at least speaking for Southeast Asia, less of a priority. And so we've seen the very middle classes who were empowered by the prosperity of the last 30, 40 years actually turn against democratic systems simply because actually what they would prefer is for their children to be safe at school. They would prefer to have security in their neighborhoods. And when we see in the Philippines the war on drugs, which has killed now, I think, 14,000 people since 2016. And it's still a very popular policy. And I think that no one has raised the question of should there be justice, should the police not kill innocent people without, bringing them to court. No, people want security.
Yeah, no, people, ordinary people love it when drug dealers are killed, or alleged drug dealers are killed, until it turns out to be their own child or their own niece, and they suddenly realize, actually, there is a problem when there is no rule of law, there is a problem when there is no justice.
Well, actually, there's a very funny story about a man who was shot by the police in the Philippines, and they took him for dead, but he was dragged off to the police station because he had signs of life. And at the police station, he woke up. And the press was there, and they said, "Do you agree with President Duterte's war on drugs?" "Yes, I agree."
But isn't this, this middle-class belief in authoritarianism, isn't this something that comes straight out of China's playbook? China says, look, this Western democracy thing doesn't really work. We, the Chinese Communist Party, we provide economic growth, we provide security for the people, we impose peace, we impose law and order, everybody's getting richer, what's not to like? Is that not a fair comment? And are we not guilty of Orientalism in wishing that everybody was a liberal democracy? Is that not a fair criticism? In other words, why shouldn't Southeast Asian economies be successful and authoritarian?
Well, let's take the case of Indonesia, which is, I suppose, increasingly an outlier because it's the one successful democratic transition that remains very much on track. The founding principles of that nation were very much democratic, were very much in there were sort of socialistic elements and influences, but they nonetheless conceived of themselves as a democratic nation. And of course, there was a 30-year period of authoritarian rule, but they've come around, and the reason why it's so robust in Indonesia, even though it's now threatened to some extent by these fears of security, is that the initial vision of their nation was essentially one that is democratic. And so I would argue that across Southeast Asia, in Myanmar, the arguments are really over whether there should be a federal state under a democratic system. One of the major problems has been that security is such a big issue for people, and that's why the army has always had such an important role to play as the so-called guardians of the state. It's fundamentally different from China, which conceived of itself very much as a communist state, with this notion of a very centralized totalitarian system. In Southeast Asia, I argue the use of the term demi-democracy, where people want to have basic institutions, they want to have a form of government that will periodically change, but they love to have leaders who are strong, and their politics is mostly about personality.
What we used to call soft authoritarianism, I think, in the 90s. I mean, since we're on the subject of Indonesia, you've written how many books about Indonesia?
Two novels and one book.
And
before.
One non-fiction.
Yeah.
They're all books, by the way. They're all books.
A biography of Suharto.
Right, and a non-fiction book about Indonesia as well, no? Or was that...
no, it was...
Yeah, that was the biography of Suharto. But tell us a little bit, because it is, for those of you who don't know Southeast Asia well, roughly, a third or 2/5 of the population of Southeast Asia are Indonesians. It's known as the largest Muslim country in the world, I think still just about, in terms of population. And you pointed out yourself, it is a bit of an outlier. And because of its size and importance within Southeast Asia, it's an important outlier. You've been pretty recently, you keep going to Indonesia, right? How do you see things evolving there? And are you you seem to be less pessimistic about Indonesia than you are about the rest?
There are certainly lots of problems on the horizon. I mean, one of the major problems has been one that I think all countries in this region are facing, which is rising levels of intolerance between religious communities. And the specific problem in Indonesia has been, over a long period of time, which is a Muslim-majority country, it's a Sunni Muslim country, more than 80, 85, close to 90% of the population are Muslim. Traditionally, Islam in Indonesia accommodated minorities and was rather, as Lee Kuan Yew would put it, it was sort of tropical Islam. But it was nonetheless very seriously an Islamic country. And what I argue is that over the last 30 years, Saudi Arabia has spent millions and in fact billions of dollars perhaps around this region on establishing a formal Islamic education system which purveys a form of Islam which is much more conservative and exclusive than Indonesians were ever accustomed to. And this, I think, has had a rather corrosive effect on degrees and levels of tolerance. We're seeing it elsewhere in Malaysia as well, but it's a particular problem in Indonesia because there was a form of Islam that accommodated local cultures, other religions, and indeed, most importantly, in the constitution, Indonesia was never defined as an Islamic state. And what we're seeing with this growth in Salafist teachings across the country, mosque building programs, and the induction of young kids into schools where they receive this formal, very, very rigid form of education, is that you start to have a society that questions the fact that, yes, Indonesia is a majority Muslim country, why aren't we Islamic state? Why should we tolerate non-Muslims in our space? Why should we allow people to build churches in our towns and villages? This is the real threat. And not just because of society, because in these young democracies, what I find so interesting is that when they establish political parties to have sort of free-for-all elections, instead of saying, well, I belong to a party that represents, green tents, they say, well, if I'm a Muslim and I walk into this town and I want votes, why don't I just promise to have Sharia law? Because that will get me votes. I can't be bothered to sell green tents. And that, I think, is a really corrosive influence, not just the sort of the news stories you read about conservative hardline Islamic extremists or radicals coming in, but politicians themselves basically saying, well, it's lowest common denominator politics, easiest way to get elected, and that's helped change society.
Yeah, no, I remember in the 90s being told, don't worry, Southeast Asian Islam is different, it's syncretic, it's, you know, in Indonesia it's all mixed up with Javanese tradition, there's nothing to worry about. And I said, well, hang on a minute, we've got an Islamic separatist insurgency in southern Thailand, and in Java it's considered normal Sunday sport to burn down churches. And I said, if those were mosques, how would people feel? And you know, so since for the last 30 years, this situation has been progressively continuing.
What's very interesting, I tell a story in the book about my very first arrival in Indonesia when I was a young journalist, and I used to go to a city called Bandung, and Bandung was a center for education, and of course in those days there was no campus politics, there was no freedom on campuses, and so young students, in order to experience some freedom, they went to the mosque. Because the secret police weren't interfering in the mosque. And at that time, the predominant influence on Islam was actually from the Iranian Revolution. I mean, this was like 86, 87, so less than a decade after the Iranian Revolution. And kids were really taken with what had happened in Iran. And I remember talking to some of the teachers that I got to know, and they were worried. They said, well, these kids are coming to the mosque, they're abandoning the classroom, and they're coming to the mosque and they're learning the Quran by rote. Is that going to make them better doctors and dentists? And are they going to abandon their other studies? And are they going to be sort of conditioned to learn this kind of thing and not what they should be learning to acquire these professions? And that was in the mid-1980s.
So you are kind of pessimistic. In fact, when I said, talking to Michael just beforehand, I said to him, you know, my review said your book was really pessimistic, and other people have said the same thing. Do you now think that actually, you know, you were too pessimistic? I think your answer was negative, right? What did what are you looking at your book, which was presumably written about the actual writing was presumably done a few months ago? Do you still think you were right to be pessimistic?
Well, for the most part, on this central issue of the selfishness of ruling elites and the way in which they're undermining democratic institutions in the region, absolutely. I mean, in the Philippines, we're now moving into an era where the president is banning, trying to close down the free media, which has never happened before in the Philippines. The war on drugs continues apace. In Thailand, the military government has not given any indication that it's going to hold an election this year. In fact, they've just passed a law so that they can postpone the election into next year. When I wrote the book, there was hope that the election in Cambodia would happen and that the opposition would vote the Cambodian People's Party, which is Hun Sen's party, almost out of office. Well, now he's threatening to cancel the election. And I
guess the Rohingya crisis also arose in very recent months, didn't it?
The Rohingya crisis was, of course, on the radar very much because the violence began in 2012. There was an outbreak of serious violence in October last year. But what has happened since, I think, has taken everyone by surprise. It is simply the largest humanitarian crisis that Asia has faced, at least since the Vietnamese boat crisis. But if you think that the Vietnamese boat crisis of the mid-1970s onwards, almost 1 million people left the shores of Vietnam, but that was over a 20-year period. Here we have almost 1 million people leaving Myanmar in the space of 6 months.
So, you know, come back to this issue of whether you're not being too, if you like, Western-rooted in all this. The title of your book is Blood and Silk. That, to me, sort of has echoes of, I don't know if any of you remember, Stan Sessa had a travel book, I think, about Southeast Asia called Lands of Charm and Cruelty, which is the classic sort of Orientalist view. You know, it's sort of sinister, Asians, charming, but also dangerous, you know. Have you been criticized for that by your friends in the region? Have they sort of said, oh, come off it, you know, blood and silk? What about, you know, microchips and telephones?
No, I think most people would argue, I mean, very few people like to give voice to this, but there's a deep sense of disappointment among my friends who've struggled for the most part for the last 20, 30 years, whether in civil society or in politics, and even reformers in military outfits in Indonesia and Myanmar, to see, for the military it's often been, I want to be more professional. Why should I continue to have to live off the land? In militaries that I've worked with in Southeast Asia, it's not that they necessarily believe in a different political system. There is a kind of sense in which they want to develop professionally. And, Indonesia's military, it's not often said, but, the democratic transition in Indonesia in 1998 was very much facilitated by the fact that military officers in Indonesia had already decided to reform, which I don't think is the case in Myanmar. Yeah. There's a great deal of disappointment among my political friends who see that however hard they've worked over the years to build political parties in a more pluralistic context, there is still the selfishness of the leaders of these political parties who see them as platforms to enrich themselves. These are not things that are imposed as perceptions from the outside. These are realities.
Actually, to quote your own book, I was very struck by this sentence. You talk about, in fact, you reverse, my criticism. It's actually Westerners who are more optimistic about Southeast Asia than the locals themselves. You say there's a distinct contrast between Pollyanna-ish Westerners, all agog over the glitz and growth in the region, predicting its glorious future, and anxious Southeast Asians, rich and poor, who harbor worries of lurking catastrophe. So in fact, according to the people that you've met, and they are obviously all Southeast Asians, whether they're from Indonesia or Malaysia or Singapore, they're the gloomy ones. It's not the foreigners, it's not the foreign investors who are actually remarkably cheerful about the whole thing. Is that right?
Yes, one of the most influential characters on my sojourn in Southeast Asia was the great Indonesian writer. I don't think he would call himself a novelist. He was a writer and a revolutionary, Pramudia Anantatur.
But he wrote some great novels.
He wrote some great, but they were very historical, and they were in a way almost commentaries on what he believed about the country. He used the novel and he used the characters that he often put together in prison camp to establish a narrative of what he believed Indonesia was about and should have been. I knew him quite well, and towards the end of his life, he became very bitter, and he always took this view that Indonesia, for all its successes, and I would be the optimist in the room, and he would say, but we're a nation of coolies. We simply adopted the same mechanisms that the Dutch used to subjugate us, to subjugate our own people. And this was a very powerful narrative. And there's a book that none of you will ever have read called The Great Post Road. It's a very slim volume. Actually, he wrote it as a script for a documentary.
I have, actually.
And it's about the road that was built by the great Dutch, or infamous Dutch Governor-General Daendels, from one end of Java to the other. And it's one of the early sort of genocides that no one has ever recorded, or very, very, about 70,000 people, I think, were killed in the process of building this road. And he uses that as a metaphor for the contemporary Indonesia, where in 1965, no one really knows, but possibly 1 million people, I use the term 500,000 people just to be conservative, were killed in the anti-communist pogroms launched by the Indonesian military. And no one has ever been, there's never been any accountability. No one has ever, all attempts by human rights commissions, by outsiders, by insiders, to sort of somehow explain what happened and who might be held accountable, nothing has ever happened.
Pramudia Anantatur, didn't he win the Nobel Prize for Literature? Or?
Unfortunately not.
Oh, but he was nominated, or I can't remember. I remember there was he won something towards the end of his life, I believe. But anyway, or maybe he was on the shortlist, or everyone thought he was going to win.
I used to be told by friends in literary circles that the problem with Pramudia is that he comes from a country that Europeans consider to be dark and forbidding, and they blame the country for what happened in East Timor. Poor Pramudia.
Yeah, he's one of the greatest unknown, great novelists of the world, definitely. Before I ask you to read a passage, I'm just going to ask you to address something that I think will be of interest to people in the audience, and then we'll open it up to your questions. And that is, all these things that are happening in Southeast Asia, several of the countries are either just across the sea from or border on India and certainly on South Asia. What effects are the developments in Southeast Asia having on this part of the world, on South Asia, and particularly on India? How is India responding, and how should it respond to this kind of undermining of democracy, and indeed the rise of China in Southeast Asia, the rise of Chinese influence in Southeast Asia?
Well, as you know, right, I mean, you mentioned earlier that the 10 ASEAN leaders were in Delhi for the India-ASEAN summit, which is,
that was Modi trying to counterbalance, wasn't it? Yeah.
Well, I mean, to me, it's been and my Indian friends know this, it's been a perpetual disappointment to me that India has not played more of a role in the development of modern Southeast Asia. I particularly believe that India could have played a bigger role in helping Myanmar to sort out its form of government. You know, to me, the form of government that might be of use in Myanmar's tangle of sort of ethnic and religious groups would be a form of union government that's not quite fully federal but has federal characteristics that, because in all the countries of Southeast Asia, Myanmar has whole chunks of territory that, like India, have ethnic groups that dominate in them, or used to dominate. And that, in other words, the boundaries of these territories are contiguous with ethnic and linguistic groups. Shan State, for instance, Kachin State. Now, of course, demographically, they're very mixed populations now. But for me, it's a unique situation where a form of government has to provide them with their rights, their linguistic rights, and yet remain within the whole. And that's something that India has done very successfully. And yet, a lot of the experts who go in and talk to Myanmar about federalism are from European countries. Where it's the sort of textbook federalism, as opposed to
So you think India should be more engaged in that part of the world?
I think that, you know, I've always felt that India's reluctance, I mean, very much based on its traditional foreign policy of looking after its neighborhood mostly, and not wishing to get too involved in countries in Southeast Asia, is something of a missed opportunity.
But it now has not only a look east policy, but it has an act east policy. But you're right, in terms of implementation, it's sadly lacking. You know, a couple of years back, I went up Asian Highway number 1, which is supposed to link East Asia to Europe through northeast India, and unfortunately, there's very little happening on the border there. It's actually like a little border post with no road traffic going across it, just, you know, hand carts and...
Well, I travelled to More in Manipur about 3 years ago, and what was striking is that when a local low-cost airline from Myanmar had established a flight from Mandalay to Imphal, you know, everyone in Imphal was saying, finally, we have access to goods that we want, a market that we want to interact with, and so on. But for the flight was very short-lived. I thought that this was a real example of perhaps the look east and acting east. The flight was very short-lived, and it returned to the sort of the slow trickle of goods that flow across the border and are interfered with by the Assam Rifles.
Yeah, and it's there's every sort of few thousand yards there's a roadblock of corrupt people stopping you and shaking down every truck and every car that passes and basically asking for money.
And that's, you know, that's a very vivid illustration of the boundary that still exists between Southeast Asia and South Asia. China has more successfully, perhaps, at least in that area of Yunnan and Myanmar, and also along the border with Laos. I mean, the contrast is that the Chinese are coming in large numbers, building industrial estates, you know, facilitating trade. I mean, billions of dollars of trade pours across the Chinese border into Myanmar.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's very little trade going up to More, which is on the Myanmar border. One reason for that is that the road is in very poor condition, and in fact, some of the bridges were Bailey bridges put in by the Australian engineers during the Second World War, and they even have the date and the name of the people who put it there. And they're single-lane bridges that can take one lorry at a time across these rivers, and I was quite surprised to find that the bridges had not been replaced.
I mean to sound a slight note of optimism, I do think that this time around, the love affair between, or the affair, if you like, between India and ASEAN is a little more serious. I think perhaps because of the strategic, you know, considerations that you mentioned. I also think that obviously much has changed in India's economy and outlook towards the rest of the world, and that makes it easier. But I do think that it's almost too late for India to act as a counterbalance. And for much of ASEAN, for the Southeast Asian countries, they still look to the US as that counterbalance. And I don't think that, certainly Myanmar would find it, I think, almost impossible to imagine balancing and playing India off China. In many ways, it's too difficult to do because it would lead to all sorts of security problems.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to ask you to, I think you're going to read a passage that is a little bit personal about, is it about when you first arrived in the region, is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah, and we'll read that and then we'll open it up to, and just give you a flavour of the book, which I think will be, Michael will be signing afterwards at the back of this hall. And then we'll open it up after he's read to your questions. So Michael, go ahead.
My first impressions of, I'm going to read from the introduction really to the book. My first impressions of Southeast Asia were infused with vivid tropical light and pungency, framing glimpses of complex society awkwardly embracing the modern world, yet bound by ancient traditions and conventions. Singapore in 1979, when I first arrived, had been independent for less than 20 years. Although neat and tidy compared with Indonesia or Thailand, many streets were lined with two-story shophouses from which emanated smells of cinnamon and mace. The old colonial centre around the parade ground, known as the Padang, was trimmed and in immaculate order, overlooked by the whitewashed stucco walls of the cricket club, still there today. In contrast, Bangkok was a mildewed concrete jungle punctuated at random by tropical garden compounds protecting delicate wooden houses where bureaucrats with aristocratic titles fed leftover rice to their carp in the morning and later served up the crumbs of patronage to loyal retainers. After some weeks of travel, I stayed with fellow students from London in the northern Thai capital of Chiang Mai, a city of such bucolic grace that I wondered on warm and misty mornings, or when the setting sun at the edge of twilight turned everything carnation pink, if it might be a model for paradise. The people of Chiang Mai were exquisitely mannered and polite, and with almost 100 Buddhist temples within the crumbling city walls, riding around the city brought to mind an early 17th century engraving of the old Siamese capital of Ayutthaya by some French Jesuit explorer. The city's accessible charm and bustle helped me begin to understand the basic etymology of Southeast Asian society. But for all of Chiang Mai's charms, I was drawn to Indonesia, enchanted by the ideals of nationhood riotously played out with a blend of triumph and tragedy, and to the accompaniment of a discordant clashing of brass gongs and cymbals, where nothing was as it appeared. Back in London, after completing my undergraduate studies, I applied to continue with doctoral research involving fieldwork in Indonesia. Unraveling the mysteries of Indonesia played to my own conflicted and complex identity as a Levantine polyglot transplanted to the West. I wrote my undergraduate history thesis on Sukarno, the first president of Indonesia, whose biographical details I devoured, recalling that my Greek auntie Zoe had once met him and received a signed portrait of a man when she worked as secretary at the Indonesian legation in Rome in the 1960s. There was a strangely subliminal impulse behind my attraction to Indonesia.
Thank you very much. I was struck by that line about ancient societies, overwhelmed by the modern world and the sort of the difficulties of the modern world. When I was young and impressionable and working in Southeast Asia, I once approached the heart of this ancient Khmer temple, and I was sort of prepared to be awestruck, and because I was apparently on my own, and I heard this strange burbling noise, and you sort of go around these walls and another wall, and then there in the heart of this temple was a Khmer woman wearing traditional clothes and playing a Game Boy, which is where the electronic burbling noise came from. And I remember thinking, well, yeah, so it's not all holiness. So I would like to now open it up. I believe there are some travelling mics, and there's a woman there with glasses, and then a couple of people here. Maybe we could start off, and then somebody on the left. Yeah. Try and state your question fairly briefly, and then yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Victor, in your talk, you spoke about the rise of conservatives and the rise of more conservative governments, more authoritarian, or and you quoted the U.S., you cited Brexit, and there's Abe, there's other governments, and most of these have actually come out of democratic processes. They're actually the will of the people in a way. Yes. So where do you think liberalism has maybe failed that, we now see this massive movement? Okay,
so Michael, where has liberalism failed?
Well, one explanation is in the failure to defend, in the failure to build and strengthen institutions that defend liberalism. I was very struck by a big story here in India, when the Supreme Court judges came out and said that democracy in India had been threatened. And the reason they said so was because of the way that the judiciary was working. And the reason that struck me was that if only someone would do that in Malaysia, if only someone would get up and defend institutions that stand for, I actually don't like the use of the word liberal, but values that provide for equality of access to, say, health and education, where people can go and ask for something that is their right, not just liberalism per se. But those institutions are terribly weak in a part of the world where personality and the ability of people in power to use their positions to acquire wealth rather than help people. I give the example in the book of looking. There's a whole chapter on corruption, and having talked to a lot of people about anti-corruption campaigns, you begin to understand why would officials, even in an elected government, why would politicians actually want to get rid of corruption when in fact they benefit from it so much? Why would I want my children to start queuing up to go to school, to go to a particular school, when I can get them in using my position? And so it's very hard without proper institutions to actually defend those values.
And that's why institutions are so important in India, not just the voting, but all the other institutions like the rule of law and the police force. Yes, gentleman there, and then that gentleman, and then someone here in the front, and then, yeah. We may not have time for that many, but we'll do as many as we can. So ask your question briefly.
You talked a lot about systemic flaws in a lot of Southeast Asian countries that are causing these problems. So I was wondering what your take is on the opinion that it is, in fact, institutions or practices left over from colonialism or structures of neocolonialism that are causing a lot of these systemic problems, be it CIA assassination attempts or the IMF and the World Bank and their policies and so on and so forth.
So is this a legacy of
the
West?
Myanmar is Exhibit A. Even the language that is used in Myanmar to justify the way in which society is kept divided draws very much on the divide and rule legacy of the British colonial era. And the same goes for Malaysia, where the British wanted to keep the races apart, and now the political system keeps the races apart. And so, quite apart from the other things one can talk about, that's a very good example of the colonial legacy. But the Bretton Woods institutions you refer to have, for the most part, benefited Southeast Asia because the economies of Southeast Asia have been, by and large, rather well run, and therefore they've benefited from. There was during the IMF crisis, the financial crisis of 1997, the IMF developed very good working relationships with the technocrats who ran these economies to find that there wasn't a lot of national debt. They had just been, they'd just been overextended, and they'd been turning a blind eye to, corrupt practices that had led to the fact that banks didn't have the capacity to service the loans. But the economies themselves were fairly well run, and you have the ADB. sitting in the Philippines.
What were they called in Indonesia? The Harvard Club or something?
Yeah, it was mostly Lehman Brothers, I think.
Yeah. Let's a lady there, and then we'll come back to this side. You next, and then gentleman right in the front there. Yeah.
My name is Wendy. I'm from Australia. I'd just like Michael to comment briefly about big power influence in the region. So America's role in the region, or the US role under Trump, is a bit uncertain at the moment. China's got this big Belt and Road investment planned through Southeast Asia. And then we have Saudi Arabia giving gifts of $1 billion to the Prime Minister of Malaysia, and also the influence in Indonesia. Again, that division between Catholic, Islam, East Asian, Middle Eastern. Thank you.
Thank you. So the US withdrawing.
So it's a long story, but towards the end of the book, I delve into these, what I consider to be the two big geopolitical currents buffeting Southeast Asia. And one, of course, is the rise of China and the contest between China and the US. But the other actually is, as you mentioned, I mean, I consider the influence that Saudi Arabia has had on Islam in the region to be very much a geopolitical current. It's come from outside. And it's helped, you know, the clash between the US and China is not leading to warfare anytime soon in Southeast Asia, but the way that Saudi Arabia has influenced Muslim communities has had an incredibly strong effect on their societies. So I would argue in many ways that's the more important one.
I mean, of course, those outside influences have been around for a long time. I was always, when I first went to Yemen, I couldn't work out why everyone wore sarongs, and of course they came from Indonesia. And in fact, the former foreign minister of Indonesia had a Yemeni name, didn't he? Alatas, yeah. Yes, gentleman there, and then in the front, yeah.
Yeah, on a completely different tack. As an employer of people with MA and MBA degrees in both South Asia and Southeast Asia, I find there is no comparison between the human resources in the two regions.
Between
South Asians,
between
South Asia and Southeast Asia.
So which are better?
The South Asians are far superior to Southeast Asians. And yet when you travel in Southeast Asia, you find it's visibly more prosperous. How do you explain this? And what is your prognostication for the future?
What do you mean by superior?
So you're saying that the MBAs, and these are, when you say MBAs, you mean they've been to American MBA courses? Or?
Not necessarily, but you know, local
or INSEAD
MAs or local MBAs and so on. There's just no comparison.
Maybe it's because India has a bigger pool, or South Asia has a bigger pool of people to call on, because Southeast Asia is what, 500-600 million people. South Asia is 2 billion, right? But maybe that's a...
Well,
what do you think?
One short answer would be, you know, when it comes to economic... I mean, my book, it really isn't about business and economics, and I studiously avoided that. But one of the observations I've always had is that if it were not for the overseas Chinese community that has essentially ensured that however stupid and ridiculous the politicians are, the businesses run well, the goods get to market, there are very sophisticated ways in which the consumer is provided with the goods and services, and actually that the spread of prosperity has worked along that sort of well-oiled set of rails.
But why not in India?
It's a cliche, but corruption in East Asia works because people only take 10%. And unfortunately, in South Asia, it's like 70 to 80%, or sometimes 100%. And, you know, I really think that is a problem, as it has been in some countries such as Nigeria and Africa. But let's go to the gentleman here right in the front, and then back to that side. Yeah,
this is a question for both of you, since both of you have covered the region. And this is that Lee Kuan Yew was hugely admired in India. And there is a great fascination and desire that someone like Xi Jinping or Deng Xiaoping should actually be, you know, if he were to be in charge, India wouldn't have the problem. So the same kind of middle-class aspirations you're talking about that you see over there are also present here, that people want certain kind of order. And at the same time, you were talking about the judges who are talking about a different kind of more institutional rather than person-based politics. What would be your advice to Indians who are looking up to Lee Kuan Yew or Mahathir or whatever?
Stay with your institutions. I mean, I think, you know, to me, one of the most tragic examples is Malaysia, which is the most analogous country with India in terms of the institutions that were bequeathed, the courts supposedly independent from the government. And I think what's been really sad is that these institutions have really deteriorated, and that has allowed the current Prime Minister in Malaysia, Najib Tun Razak, to play the race card, to play religion, to prey on the fears of people that there's nothing to defend them other than him, other than his leadership. In the past, they would have said, well, we can go to court. Yes, there are institutions the parliament will defend us. So that's being swept away. And so my advice is, really focus on preserving those institutions, because that's what's missing in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I would just say briefly that there's a big difference between running a country of 1.3, 1.4 billion people and running a city-state which is basically something like the size of Pune. I mean, this is not the same thing at all. And also Singapore had this great sort of myth that the British left this impoverished place with nothing. It's completely untrue.
It's untrue.
There was an entrepot that was incredibly prosperous. Of course, there was poverty, but there was poverty in Britain. There was poverty all over the world at that time. And this was not built out of nothing, whereas the situation in India was much more difficult. And of course, India is a very, very difficult place to govern. And it's not just because of Indian people, it's because of the institutions of government that are very difficult to manage. But we should probably stick to...
That didn't stop Lee Kuan Yew thinking that he could give advice to the Chinese government, though, and the Indian government.
Yeah. And don't forget that Singapore's projects in China, or one of Lee Kuan Yew's pet projects, famously failed because he tried to sort of transfer the Singapore model to China, and it didn't work, and it's just not the same place, so very difficult to transfer. There's a gentleman, yes, you've been waiting some time.
Sir, you mentioned that there is a rising level of intolerance in the Southeast. So can you please perhaps elucidate it in context with Socialist Republic of Vietnam?
Yes, a lot of people have asked me this. Vietnam, is, I think, a bit of an outlier in the region because, for one thing, its society is quite different from the rest of Southeast Asia. It's more similar. It's similar in social makeup to say China, because it's a Confucian-based society, and this makes it rather different from the other societies which were very much influenced by Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. Having said that, you have a very successful communist regime that has not changed, where its leaders are not really accountable to the electorate as such. And yet, if you look at Vietnam today, it's growing in excess of 8 to 10% the last 20 years. You have a growing middle class that's extremely satisfied with their lot. What little political activity you've had in the last year or so has, interestingly, been the communist authorities punishing corrupt officials. And they've used those corruption trials to actually get rid of their opponents. But it's interesting, the use of anti-corruption to show that they are serving the people and that they're not stealing from the people. And I think that's a very interesting, and I think that system can actually continue for some time. We're not about to see a popular revolution in Vietnam. What we're seeing is that people are growing rich, getting very happy, much like China, where you have this growing middle class that has become very materialistic and therefore starts to get used to the predations of the Communist Party of China. And it's not really the same for the other Southeast Asian countries.
Yeah, I mean, the Vietnamese toyed with the idea of reform, perestroika, when the Soviet Union was collapsing. And after a few years, they very much turned their back on that, just like the Chinese. And like the Chinese Communist Party, the Vietnamese Communist Party is very happy that it did that, because it believes that it would have ended up in a chaotic situation, like other countries that went through of Eastern Europe. So they were very pleased with what they had not done in the end in terms of reform. I think this is going to have to be the last question. Gentleman here in the front.
Yeah, thank you for your thoughts. You remain consistent on your thoughts of India's opportunities or lost opportunities to be a regional leader per se. You said that yesterday when you spoke about China's involvement or continued involvement, and today when you spoke about Southeast Asia. So if not that, then where do you see India's role, given that all indicators point towards positive economic and military growth as far as India is concerned? So I want to know your thoughts on the other side of the spectrum.
On India's potential role. Well, as I said earlier, I think India could do a lot more to help these countries in Southeast Asia sort out some of their political governance issues. Despite, and it's not just that, you need success to be able to do that. I've often argued to the Indian government that there's a lot that India can make of its own mistakes and its own problems to share the challenges that it's had with some of these countries. And I found it very difficult to make that argument here for some reason. But I also think that increasingly, strategically, the Indian Ocean is being seen as a very important maritime area. Indonesia has taken very seriously the need for an Indian Ocean regional association and has taken the lead, actually, in helping to establish that. And I think in the future, India's going to have to cooperate with its neighbors in the Indian Ocean in a much more pointed way to create not just a sort of sense of security, but also facilitate trade. And so I see the trend more towards moving towards the Indian Ocean as an important economic and security area.
So I think that's a very good note to end it on. Thank you so much, Michael. His book is Blood and Silk. Thank you very much indeed.
That brings us to the end of the day at the Rajan Kilachan Mughal tent. Thank you again to Michael Vatikiotis and Victor Mallet. They're both very happy to sign copies of books and have a further chat at the book signing tent just at the back. You guys know where it is by now. And I'm just going to have to read you a long list of sponsor announcements to conclude the day. So please bear with me.